You went to the FBI and reported the Attorney General of this state with no evidence. Do I have that correct?
We reported the facts to the FBI.
That's not my question. You had no evidence that Ken Paxton had done anything illegal. I want to get this straight. You went to the FBI on September 30th with your compatriots and reported the elected Attorney General of this state for a crime without any evidence. Yes?
That's right. We took no evidence.
Did you gain any after that? Did you gain any after that?
Well, we weren't collecting evidence.
Did you gain any after that?
Evidence of what, sir?
Evidence of a crime committed by the elected Attorney General in this state, elected by over 4 million voters. That guy.
I don't recall.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of America UnCanceled. I think Texas has captivated the attention of the nation for many good and bad reasons. One of the most tawdry of those reasons was the recent attempt to undo the last election in Texas by removing from office the very popular Attorney General, Ken Paxton. Now, if that name sounds familiar, it's because he's spoken on our CPAC stage. I think every year he's been in office. He appears on this show a lot. And more than all of that, he is the Attorney General in the country, not necessarily because he has the most power or authority. He just has the most guts, and he takes on the Biden administration more times than really any other Attorney General in the country. And, of course, it's a very important state where that's being overrun at the border on a daily basis. And Ken Paxton is someone who I kept up with throughout his race. He had this really kind of interesting primary race where his Republican opponents were saying that he was going to get indicted by the feds and he would be convicted and he wouldn't be able to serve out his term. And I remember talking to one of his primary opponents and saying, well, how come you're so sure this is going to happen? Like, is this some kind of like a secret that only certain people get to know about? So that's how the primary went. And Ken Paxton had a big win in that primary. And then he went off to a runoff and had an even bigger win in the two-man race. There was a lot of polling at the end of the general election saying that all the Republicans were in a real barn burner, including the governor, the lieutenant governor, the AG, and then on Election Day, everyone won by a pretty healthy percentage because I think Texas is getting a little bit more red. And then what happened to Ken Paxton after he survived all those elections? He had another kind of an election, a bit of a coup. It's legal to go through the process of being impeached and being removed from office. It's in the Texas Constitution, much like they tried to do to Donald Trump at the national level. But it doesn't mean that using those powers is justified. And, for many of us, we were watching these clips, we were watching Twitter, we were trying to figure out what was happening. The lawyers who worked on behalf of Ken Paxton really gave the best impressions to that profession. And one of them is with us today, the lawyer who really kind of started to break open this idea that this was a faux impeachment, there was really no proof of wrongdoing, is Mitch Little, a partner with Schief and Stone down there in Texas. Mitch, congratulations on really breaking this thing wide open, presenting in such a clear fashion, and by the way, being plenty tough, which I really like. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here with you. We are overjoyed at the outcome of this and could not be happier to put the most conservative, aggressive, effective Attorney General back to work.
Well, I didn't want to really get into your politics because you can hire a lawyer with any kind of political views, but it sounds like you also think he's a good Attorney General on the issues.
I think we have the best Attorney General in the United States. Yes, I do.
Okay, we've already started agreeing with each other, so I won't be a disagreeable witness. But Mitch, let's get right into this thing. You knew what they were charging. We all knew what they were charging because so many of us had been called to see if we'd endorsed one of Ken's opponents. There was no chance that was going to happen with CPAC, but along the way, everyone was kind of like murmuring and whispering all this bad stuff to come. How terrible is that in this process that people just kind of feel like they can get away with swiping and sliming somebody with the fact that, oh, the big one's about ready to come from the FBI or somebody else?
What what I hate about what happened to Ken Paxton is that so much of the process occurred in the shadows. When there was supposed to be transparency, he should have had an opportunity to defend himself in the House of Representatives when the charges were leveled. But the whisper campaign, the criminal allegations, and the media attacks that were essentially used as political cover for Ken Paxton's opponents, even in the primary, were disgusting. And we really had no legal opportunity to interject ourselves into the discussion until this trial. It's sad that it had to happen, but finally, everyone knows there was no there.
So, and by the way, when you talk to the primary opponents, nobody disagreed with how Ken Paxton pursued his office and his policy goals and legal goals. They all actually thought he was doing a pretty good job. It was just that they somehow knew he would be removed from office because of these legal troubles. But even all the legal questions that were out there, reported on, his problems within the state of Texas, the voters had a full chance to not only know what those were, if they cared. They were the subject of television ads. They were the subject of countless news stories. Nobody could say they were in the dark on this idea that Ken Paxton had some legal questions.
It's clear from the near constant coverage of Ken Paxton that voters had an opportunity to weigh what the allegations were, or the suppositions, or the assumptions that the media was credulously tweeting, retweeting, reporting. The problem with the election is no one could ever get to the right of Ken Paxton. No one could ever deny that he was effective at doing his job and doing what he said he was going to do. So the only way to attack him was to link arms with the left and undermine him with rumor, supposition.
You know, Mitch, there's two ways that a case can come to you that a high-profile case, you have to figure out what the strategy is. You have that case that has a lot of tawdry facts to it, and when it becomes public, it'll be very hard to deal with the media. But then you have the other case, which is what this case was, which was completely covered by the media, nonstop, in kind of a National Enquirer, tabloid kind of way. And then you have to try to defend this case, which is kind of yucky. Is it easier to deal with a case that's been made much about that there's nothing to, than the opposite case when there's some stuff there, but there's been no coverage and you know it's going to unfurl and start to get ugly? Well, in some ways, wasn't this easier to pick apart, knowing that it had already been completely covered in all the major newspapers, not only in Texas but all over the country?
Honestly, it was easier on the law, but when you are dealing with what I call the extra juror, the mainstream media who is saying, "Ick, isn't this yucky?" and there's granite countertops and there's bribes, and constantly making allegations without any facts or evidence to support them. When you finally get in a trial, the trial was easier than most trials you're going to experience because there just wasn't a lot of evidence there. I think the prosecutors hoped that they could just throw enough things at the wall and there would be an ick factor to where the senators would simply say, "We just don't, he probably didn't commit a crime, but we just don't want him to be attorney general anymore." Well, that's not the law. And so when you're actually in a courtroom, or here it was the Texas Senate, and you're dealing with the elements of an offense, you're dealing with the elements of an impeachment allegation, and you're putting on witnesses, introducing exhibits, making arguments, that's when everything starts to fall apart.
All right, I want to go to two pieces. The next piece of the whisper campaign was the whisper campaign in the corridors of power. I can't tell you how many people I like and respect, when I brought this up, said, "Oh yeah, that's terrible about Ken. He's not guilty, but he's going down." So there was this kind of other thing. I don't know if that was kind of like trying to influence the jury, these politicians in the state Senate, or what, but there was this kind of very slick desire to make it seem like, oh yeah, Ken's the victim, but he just doesn't have the votes. Walking into the state Senate chamber, was the assumption that this was going to be an uphill battle to hold the votes?
That was never my assumption. I resisted any desire to think that way. I think if you're a pessimist, you could walk into the Texas Senate and say, we may have already lost before we walked in here. I never felt that way. I always felt we were going to win the case. I always felt that the evidence and the rule of law would reign supreme over this dispute. I think what happened is the senators, when they finally came to the moment of being faced with doing their job, fulfilling their oath, listening to the evidence, they actually did it. And after we had the trial, the prosecutors and the team of House Board of Managers, both from Republican and Democrat, who wanted to see Ken Paxton go down, they got up and they impugned the character of the senators who voted and said, well, this was just a political vote, as if to say that the case couldn't have been won. Well, I guess we'll never know because they never introduced any evidence to support all the allegations, right?
Well, that's the key clip to me. I mean, I watched it again today, and I watched it the day it happened. But you had this, I'll call him young-looking attorney who Ken Paxton had hired, who apparently, you got to be awfully careful with your staff these days, Mitch, but he apparently thought it was a good idea to drop a dime to the FBI and say that he was under the strong impression that Ken Paxton was taking bribes. And when you got him in the stand, you very adroitly cornered him on the fact that he actually had no proof. And I guess you didn't even get to motive as to why you would do something to your boss if you don't even have any proof, why you would call the FBI to try to trigger an investigation. Is that the key moment when everyone realized that this was just kind of a sham?
So when this young man took the stand, I thought about what it must have taken for him to go to the FBI. And we had 400,000 pages of discovery dropped on us in the month and a half leading up to this trial. We went through all of it. And I knew that he didn't bring anything to the FBI because they didn't have any documentary evidence or any type of real hard data to bring to the FBI. And I just decided when I got up to cross-examine him, I just said, I'm going to go for it. I know there's nothing there. And it's one of those moments it felt like an out-of-body experience. You feel like your cross-examination is going well, and then you come over to counsel table and you go to sit down and I'm asking one of my co-counsel, was that okay? And his eyes are about this big and his mouth is wide open. I think we did something here.
Well, what it was is justice was seen. That's why we have this kind of arbitrary setup, right? So you get to see if you can get to the truth. And so what you're really telling me, it was a live show and a live trial, and it went better than you could have imagined, but it takes that process to get there. If they had done that on the House side, we never would have had to have this kangaroo court on the Senate side.
I think you're absolutely right. The House Board of Managers broke the law. I think that is now clear. They were required by the Texas government code to place witnesses under oath, to take testimony under oath every time impeachment has been performed since the creation of Texas. It's been used 3 times, twice against a statewide official. That official had an opportunity to examine the witnesses, to defend himself, to show up in the House and provide evidence. Here in Texas, you may or may not know, the entire thing was truncated to about 4 days.
Yeah.
The House had 48 hours, 2 days, to consider the quote-unquote evidence, which was simply lawyers credulously repeating what they had heard from other witnesses. And then the House voted. And when it was happening in real time, I was at my son's baseball game watching him play baseball, and after I saw the vote count, I was so disgusted. I turned to my wife and I said, there went my summer.
So you knew, you already knew at that point you were enlisted in this cause, right?
I didn't, but I wanted the ball. Yeah. I mean, I've represented Ken Paxton for 8 years at this point, and I know what these people were saying was untrue.
So so you see this overwhelming vote in the House. So for people like me living outside of Washington, D.C., I look at all these Republicans voting for impeachment. That was, I guess, intentional to try to look like it was so overwhelming that, my gosh, he should almost just resign. Did the size of that House vote shock you?
It was shocking in that I knew many of the people who voted, and these were people who had continuously supported Ken Paxton and his agenda. But what you need to understand is the Speaker of the House of Representatives is a political enemy of the Attorney General and of conservatives in the state of Texas. And he was whipping every vote that he could, pulling every card, pulling every trick he could to get as many votes as possible, because he wanted this to go over to the Senate as a fait accompli and for the Attorney General to be convicted. Except that we were not afraid to put on the truth.
I think this is interesting. I've been reading these stories that came out about Kristi Noem and her personal life as soon as she endorsed Donald Trump. I noticed that the Washington Post, which is always either the first or second paper that jumps on ethics questions with Republicans, they're like having this whole question about Tim Scott and does he really have a girlfriend? There's a gentleman who works hard against human trafficking who helped produce this great movie, Sound of Freedom. And now they're saying, Tim Ballard, they're saying, Tim, oh my gosh, he's a serial sexual harasser on the workplace. Can I ask you a question? Why
Please.
is it only Republicans that it seems like the media wants to dig in and say terrible things about their personal life, and they don't really seem to ever cover Democrats? My guess is, and you guys brought this up, that if they were talking about sexual purity in the Texas state Senate or the state House, my guess is there'd be a lot of Democrats people could talk about too.
What disturbs me is that I think today in 2023, the media is very different from when you and I were growing up. They see it as their God-given duty to control the national narrative in favor of their political lens or political agenda. And everyone in politics who does not agree with them is simply grist for that mill.
Yep.
And it's disturbing. I think we as conservatives need to look at the media, understand their role, and comport ourselves accordingly, that we should really have nothing to do with them most of the time.
Yeah, I can't agree with you more. And I guess my point is that they go well beyond policy differences, and they always make it personal, and they always make it about ethics, and they always make it, whenever they can, be about some kind of a sexual charge, because they know that's going to be seen as shameful to that Republican official. And you just never see it, very rarely see it go the other way. And,
why would you argue on policy? If you look at what's going on in the large cities in this country that are driven by their policy, does that look like an environment that you would want to coexist in?
And then you have the secondary thing, if you're a lawyer that gets up and speaks out for someone who's a conservative and represents them, which, there was a time in this country when we said everybody really should have legal representation. That's why we have a legal services corporation at the, well-funded at the federal level. It was always this idea you should have a lawyer. Now you have an offshoot of the activists at the ABA setting up a nonprofit to go after the lawyers who stand up for these people. Have you had to have you had to be a subject of that outrageous activity where they try to harm your book of business because you had the guts to stand up for Ken Paxton?
I have not personally, but I think you may or may not know that Ken Paxton and his first assistant, Brent Webster, were sued by the state of Texas bar, seeking to impact their licensure, dealing with the election results and briefs that were filed on behalf of the state of Texas. I think here's my takeaway, and I don't fear any of that. I'm not going to live my life in fear. When I took an oath to uphold the law, to uphold the Constitution, I'm in it. And so when a client hires me, I'm going to tell the truth. And I don't live in fear of those consequences. And frankly, Ken Paxton doesn't either. If you look at his career, he has not lived his life in fear of dealing with problems like these and attacks like these. I think indeed he expects them and confronts them.
Yeah, I agree with you. Let me ask you a final question. I know you're a Texan, and this is a little far afield from maybe what you're focusing on, but there's all this talk about subpoenaing Hunter Biden, and Kevin McCarthy recently said that they're going to start an impeachment inquiry in the House of Representatives. As someone who's just gone through a process in Texas, on the Senate side, on the conviction side, on the trial side. And now you have Republicans at the national level looking at starting this process. Would your advice be don't just push it through fast in the House because you may have the votes, but instead take your time, go through the case, let the American public savor and saturate on the facts, and let them make up their mind as to whether they think there are real crimes here?
I think the latter is what should be done. You need to take your time and do your job. If you have the evidence will speak for itself. It may not speak on ABC, CBS, MSNBC, et cetera, because they're just not going to cover it. So if you have enough information you believe to convict Joe Biden for complicity in Hunter Biden's pay-for-play scheme, bring the evidence out and let it be what it is. Don't try to just get the votes and ram it through. What a waste of our time. It was certainly a waste of time here. Let the facts and the evidence fall where they may.
Yeah, and it's for the American voter, for the American people who are busy raising their kids, trying to pay for outrageously expensive, daily items like gasoline and food and everything else. It takes them a little bit of time because they're not maybe that political, because they're normal, to clue into something. And so covering it, there's no excuse for taking those shortcuts. And I think, I don't know how long the process took in the Senate, but I'm glad it took the time it took for us all to realize, I'm not going to swear, but I could, that it was a bunch of horse hockey.
Yeah, I think that's a good word for it. As the Biden family works their way through that system, show us the Chinese wires, show us the Russian wires. I want to see him explain to the American people where this money came from. He ought to have to. He ought to be accountable for it.
Hey, Mitch, I just got this idea. If Jim Jordan gives you a call to come out to D.C. to help him think through how to do this, we'd all be very gratified if you'd say yes to that.
Sir, you have my phone number.
That's right. Mitch Little, thank you very much for standing up. I think it takes a certain amount of courage these days to stand up even as a lawyer, as a counsel for a politician that's doing the types of good things that Ken Paxton is doing this. We really honor you for your skill, for your courage, and we thank you so much for being with us today.
You're very kind. It was a great pleasure. Thank you.
Well, we're going to hopefully put some clips up on the show of Mitch's great work and his co-counsels. And we wish Ken Paxton and his beautiful wife all the best as they get back to work and fight for freedom. And thank you all for tuning in.